Go live to the Élysée Presidential Palace, where the French President Emmanuel Macron is welcoming Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva today. Let's listen.
A little over a year after the wonderful welcome I was given for my state visit to your country, and as we celebrate the 200th anniversary of the relations between our two countries, 200 years during which so many women and men with the same passion for Brazil have created projects to bring us together. And it was your idea, but we decided to celebrate the 200th anniversary to undertake an initiative which will, throughout the year, pay homage to the creativity of our artists from both countries, when we will visit one of the flagship exhibits at the Grand Palais. And this is also at the heart of our relationship: friendship, mutual understanding, fascination for artists and comprehension, allowing the minister to overhaul the cultural sector from cinema to heritage, and a partnership that dated back to 1948. We had the same vision of the world, the same humanism at the service of progress. With the President and the ministers, we have mentioned several of the dossiers we're working on, and the partnership at the service, above all, of the major challenges our planet is facing. The climate crisis is still here, glaring. The disappearance of biodiversity is no less alarming. More and more people have decided not to talk about it, but we are convinced that we have to continue our efforts and even to increase them. And that is the objective of our joint declaration. I will be with President in Belém during the COP30 that you're organizing. This will be a very important meeting to remobilize the international community around these objectives. And I would like to thank you, President. And we've decided that together, just before COP30, in Salvador de Bahia, we would have a meeting with several colleagues and friends from the African continent. 30 years after the Rio summit, it is now up to Brazil to pave the way once again, and France will be there by your side to announce and to reinforce our commitment and our undertakings to fight against global warming and to protect biodiversity. And you will be in Nice in just a few days, and I thank you for that, for the Summit on Oceans. That combat is inseparable from the ones I just mentioned. We will continue to fight for the protection of 30% of all ocean service, and also the Nice Action Plan. So there are two Amazonian countries, and we share the same vision of forests, of carbon sinks, and this fight against global warming and to protect biodiversity. Thank you very much for this partnership from Nice to Belém that we will consolidate all together throughout the year. Above and beyond those major challenges, we also came back to our trade agreements, which we hope to foster. I expressed to the President France's position in what we can do to improve the current text, but we share a same vision of an open, a world which is open and which protects the climate. We also talked about international crises, Ukraine, of course, the Middle East, Haiti. And lastly, we talked about our bilateral agenda. Our relation is intense, but we want to strengthen it even more. We have a business meeting tomorrow to progress on this, and also Nice will be the occasion to give even more depth to our relationship with air travel, maritime travel, land travel, energy with the renewal of nuclear power, a lot of projects that we're making progress on together, and also we have strengthened our ties in terms of defense, and we will do what we can to accompany your Navy. We've also continued to make progress around our shared projects, namely in the sector of helicopters. Our strategic partnership is balanced. And it is also a relay through the density of our human relations. In March 2024, I went to the Pasteur Institute in Sao Paulo, one of the greatest examples of scientific cooperation. And we're going even farther with a project to co-develop vaccines. And lastly, our strengthened ties are ties between two Amazonian countries, and we have never considered that anything would separate us. In March 2024, we consolidated our partnership for monitoring biodiversity and the climate through a joint institute, and the border, which is the longest border that France has with another country. And this is also the border where we have decided to strengthen our cooperation, to preserve our forests, to fight against illegal mining and human trafficking. And this is also why we had reached an agreement during the state visit to allow the exemption from visas and also to allow the transfer of inmates. This agreement has been eagerly awaited by both of our countries, as well as inhabitants of Guyana and Miapas, and I'm very happy that we have been able to reach this agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, in summary, this is what I wanted to summarize of our exchanges, which will continue throughout the day. I'm very proud that President Lula will be welcomed under the cupola of the Académie Française to take the floor, which is an extremely rare privilege, but which shows the friendship and the great respect that the immortals have for your countries, since that's what we call our members of the Academy. And then tomorrow there will be an exposition where we see each other, and also Sunday on in Monaco on the blue economy, and then in Nice for the UNOC 3 summit. So Brazil is at home in France and with our neighbors, and I know that your state visit will end in Lyon. Thank you very much for spending so much time with us, to do us the honor and the friendship, and please once again accept our strongest vows of friendship for you and your wife and your country that we love so much. Dear friends, representatives of the press, dear President Emmanuel Macron, first of all, I would like to thank you for your welcome. I came to France for this state visit, and with me we have an entire delegation to talk about the extremely important problems that need partnerships and very swift solutions. In addition to our Minister of Foreign Affairs, I have the Minister of Justice, Ricardo Lewandowski, and we wish to share with France fighting against illegal mining in L'Amapá, Guyana, and the Amazonian forest. And we have the Minister Silvio Costa, who also wishes to renew dialogue and discussions with France for ports and airports, and our Minister Margaret Menezes, who is very busy with the cultural agenda between Brazil and France. We also have the Minister of Mines and Energy, who has provided a lot of matter for our discussions between companies. We will also be talking about climate issues and the Paris Agreement, as well as funding so that we can reach the objectives set by the Paris Agreement, which is to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We also have our Minister of Development and Trade to make progress on the EU-Mercosur trade agreement. I also have a number of parliamentarians here with me on my trip. President Macron welcomed my delegation with hospitality that only a great friend can offer to their guest. This state visit is the first of a Brazilian head of state to France for the past 13 years. Our bilateral relations weakened during that period. There was less political dialogue, less trade. A first step to change the situation was provided by the historic visit of Macron's visit to Brazil last year, and my presence here in Paris aims to strengthen this rapprochement. There would not be a better symbolic occasion to reach these objectives. Today, on the 5th of June, we are also celebrating the World Day of the Environment. And during our meeting this morning, we talked about a broad bilateral program. We reviewed progress of our agreements that were reached in 2024. Over 20 agreements were signed today, and these agreements reflect the diversity and the depth of our ties. Brazil has developed important bilateral projects with France in cutting-edge technologies, for example, communication satellites and the Saint-Dumont supercalculator. We also have a program to build submarines, which is the largest cooperation initiative in the defense sector ever undertaken by our country. This program will enable us to guarantee Brazil's sovereignty over our marine areas and to build the most up-to-date shipbuilding yard. So we also wish to set up the Minas Gerais factory, which will be the only helicopter factory in the Southern Hemisphere. We're also talking about ordering more aircraft to allow Brazil's government to fight against natural disasters and criminal activities. We have a common border, and we believe in the beneficial effects of integration. And I wish that the French people would know that the largest border of France with a foreign country is not in Europe, even though France is a European country. But this border is in South America, and it's the border with Brazil. As a consequence, I would like to remind France that you must be very proud to say that you have the largest land border with the Amazonian territory. It's important that French citizens know this. France belongs to South America as well as to Europe. We are launching a new phase in the aircraft factory, and we have the means to satisfy demand in Brazil, as well as to produce helicopters for other countries in South America. We are currently talking about a new order for aircraft so that Brazil can fight very effectively against narco-trafficking, illegal mining, and illegal forestry and logging. Our territory is so large with vast expanses of forest covers, and it's very difficult to have enough helicopters to do our work. As countries sharing a long border, we are betting on integration, and the French-Brazilian Center for Biodiversity that we reactivate in 2024 will allow us to finance joint research this year once again. And the end of our differentiated visas regime, which will make it easier for people to circulate between La Mapa and French Guiana to facilitate tourism and trade between our countries. And integration also demands a coordination of our efforts to fight against all forms of traffics in illegal logging and illegal mining. And that was the object of an agreement signed today between the Brazilian police forces and French forces. And tomorrow, I will be visiting, at the end of my trip, I'll be visiting the headquarters of Interpol in Lyon, which is under the chairmanship of a Brazilian for the very first time, and is there to fight against transnational crimes, drug trafficking, and child trafficking. With President Macron, I have underlined that bilateral exchanges don't correspond to the depth of our strategic partnership in terms of trade. It is inconceivable that the figures we saw in 2024, $9 billion, be lower than those we saw in 2012. This signifies that we have a lot to do in trade, and we must make a lot of progress to increase trade between our countries. We will have a meeting with heads of enterprises tomorrow to attract more investment and integrate productive value chains. So, we are here to speak to the French and not to other Brazilians. So, the interpreters have to translate every single word because we want the French to understand exactly what it is we want. I told President Macron my conviction as to the strategic role that could be played by the EU-Mercosur trade agreement. President Macron, I would like to say it before the French and Brazilian press, that I will be the chairman of the Mercosur on the 6th for a 6-month term, and I would like to say that I fully intend to reach an agreement with the European Union during that term. So, President Macron, please open your heart to the possibility of reaching this agreement with our very dear Mercosur. This agreement would be the best response to current uncertainties with the return of unilateralism and tariff protectionism. Defending multilateralism around climate is another shared priority. COP30 will be the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement and will bring together even closer France and Brazil in their fight against global warming. Today, we have signed an agreement around hydrogen with low carbon emissions and to decarbonize the maritime sector. My participation in the United Nations Oceans Conference will highlight the importance of maritime spaces as a regulator of the climate and a source of biodiversity. Maritime biomes require as much commitment as tropical forests. The time has come to respect the engagements we have made to Mother Earth and to future generations. By November, all countries must present their new nationally determined contributions with their objectives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2035. Brazil has committed to reducing our emissions by 59 to 65%, covering all greenhouse gases in all sectors of the economy. It will not be easy, but this is our responsibility, and my government has made its commitment, and if we can't set an ambitious target, we will not be effective in keeping our commitments. If we are unable to mobilize $1.3 trillion to fight climate change, we run the risk of creating a climatic apartheid. President Macron, so I was recently in Denmark, And I was reminded that the most developed countries have promised financial contributions to the tune of $1 trillion to help countries protect their forests and keep them intact. It is always important to remember that above each tree, there's a producer, there's a fisherman, and it's important to guarantee the right of peoples living in the forest to stay in the forest with the minimum of quality of life. We need funds from developed countries. And France can partake in these efforts, as well as French Guiana, which is the part of France which is closest to us. So France must also partake in this funding effort. And while we are celebrating the 80th birthday, the United Nations, unfortunately, is seen as lacking in legitimacy and efficiency. The wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, the situation in Haiti, and so many other forgotten crises show that the reform of the United Nations Security Council has to happen now. As President Macron declared recently, recognition of the Palestinian state is a moral duty and a political requirement of all governments in the world. Brazil was one of the first countries in Latin America to do so. And all of these conflicts consume precious resources we could use for development. And the Global Alliance to Fight Against Poverty, launched last year at G20, aims to do this to put human lives at the heart of our international agenda. I know that we can count on France's support. In 2020-25, we are celebrating the 200th anniversary of our bilateral relationships, and we are looking to the future. We will strengthen our ties and trade between our societies. And this is the meaning of updating our cultural agreement that was signed by Minister Margaret Menezes. And this is also the spirit of the hundreds of events taking place in France and in Brazil since April in the framework of the cross-cultural days that President Macron and myself decided to launch last year. Dear friend, President Macron, today is also unfortunately well known for those fighting to protect the environment and the rights of indigenous people. Bruno Pereira and Dudo Philippe, two emblematic figures of defending the Amazon, were assassinated. Brazil and UNESCO decided to pay them homage by setting up investigative journalism grants to investigate climate change. 2 weeks ago, we lost our brilliant Sébastien Legado, one of the greatest photographers in the world. His camera showed the suffering of the oppressed and woke up humanity's consciousness. The best way to pay homage is to ensure that their struggles are not vain and that we continue to be determined to defend democracy, peace, and sustainable development. My dear friend, I am convinced that Brazil and France must more and more stand together to continue to defend three sacred things: democracy, multilateralism, and free trade. We cannot destroy things that were built with so much strength after the Second World War, to return to protectionism. And the fragility of democracy that is being highlighted today is highly impressive. And with the increase of radicalism of extreme right-wing parties that don't recognize institutions, that don't recognize the truth, and that are on the rise around the world, fighting against the institutions which are the very reason why the democratic regimes exist in our countries. So to defend democracy is extremely important, perhaps the most important thing we have to do. And we must not allow the end of multilateralism. You know, as well as I do, that when the European Union created the central bank, their parliament, their common currency, for me, the European Union is a universal heritage for democracy, and we must guarantee it. We cannot allow at any moment that it was so difficult to win, we cannot allow it to be destroyed.
Boa tarde, André Fontinelli, da Folha de São Paulo. A minha pergunta para os dois presidentes é sobre o conflito na Ucrânia.
So I have a question for both presidents on the conflict in Ukraine. So, what did you mention on this topic? How do you see the declaration of President Trump, who said that Vladimir Putin wants revenge for the latest drone attack by Ukraine? And the discussions between President Lula and Putin. Mr. Lula, do you believe that President Putin is willing to find a solution for peace? And President Macron, do you think that it's possible to play a role in reaching this agreement? Brazil's position is well known by President Macron and the Brazilian people. From the beginning of the war, we have stood against the territorial occupation of Ukraine by Russia. At the same time, our position against war is very clear. With China, we have drafted an agreement between 13 emerging economy countries to find a solution. Personally, I spoke with President Putin. I went to China as well. And I called President Putin a second time to say that it's extremely important to go to Istanbul to take part in the negotiations personally, and that it would send a strong signal to the entire world and to those who wish for peace. I respect the decisions of other heads of state. However, I believe in Brazil's mission to contribute to peace and the end of war. Nobody wants war. And I'm now worried because last week there was an attack on an airport in Russia by Ukraine. And I see that Trump tweeted saying that he'd discussed this with Putin and that things weren't looking good, and that Putin had said that he was going to take revenge for this attack on Ukraine. And this is something I said personally to Putin. I said, it's time to open our eyes and to put an end to the insanity of war, which destroys everything and builds nothing. Even if we build things, the lives that are lost cannot be brought back. I also spoke with Xi Jinping, and we made ourselves available to negotiate peace and to contribute to the process. But of course, this is up to the two belligerents. And unfortunately, the United Nations is politically weak and has little power to provide an opinion on this war and other wars as well. Brazil has undertaken constant efforts to increase representativity within the United Nations Security Council. On this topic, I think that simple ideas are the best. There is an attacker, and that is Russia, and there is a victim, and that is Ukraine. We all want peace, but the two belligerents aren't equal. Secondly, and these are facts, the proposal by the United States of America for a ceasefire was accepted by President Zelensky in March in Jeddah, but has constantly been refused by President Putin, who started the war and does not wish to end it. Thirdly, yes, Brazil does have an extremely important role to play, and the initiative they took with China is very important. And the President has just defended multilateralism, which is also to defend the United Nations Charter and to reach peace with full respect for the Charter of the United Nations, which is there to respect territorial integrity of nations. And this was violated by Russia and not by Ukraine. So yes, we need peace, but we mustn't be mistaken. There's only one country that violated international law, and unfortunately, they are a permanent member of the Security Council. There's one country that started the war, one country that refuses the peace. Even though we've been able to convince President Zelensky to accept the ceasefire, we will be continuing our efforts. We'll continue our talks with President Lula. I spoke with President Xi Jinping to encourage him to continue putting pressure on Russia. And now the heart of our efforts in Europe, in the United States, in China, in Brazil, in India is to put pressure on Russia to end the conflict, so we can have robust and sustainable peace to provide the guarantees that the war will not start up again.
Bonjour.
Hello, Frédéric Sayes from Radio France. I have a question for President Lula. You just mentioned your enthusiastic support for the EU-Mercosur trade agreement. But what do you say to French farmers? You know very well that they fear market distortion, especially around standards. You declared that this treaty was unacceptable as it stands. Do you think that negotiations could be opened back up, even though negotiations have been underway for the past 20 years? And what will you say to your Brazilian homologue who has just asked you to open your heart to this? Thank you very much. And thank you for defend our farmers. This is the exact discussion I had with President Lula earlier. Strategically, France is in favor of open and fair trade. We are favorable to these agreements. And myself, I defended agreements that we contributed to improving, for example, with Canada. But it's specifically because it's agreements that allow us to bring tariffs down and to open our borders. We have to do it in a just manner. This is a strategic manner, and this agreement is good for a lot of sectors, but it does place a risk on farmers in Europe, because Europe, in respect of principles that President Lula shares, this is the environment. To reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to preserve biodiversity, we prohibited the use of certain components. We've asked our farmers to change the way they do their work. But the countries of the Mercosur have not reached the same regulatory level, so there is a major difference here. It's not a question of competitiveness, but rather standards. They're not respecting the same norms. I cannot tell French farmers, when I'm asking them to respect ever more standards, that I'm going to open up the market to people who don't respect those same standards. It won't be better for the climate, and it will kill off our farming sector. And this won't be fair, but this is not the vision of President Lula. So we have to improve the agreement to ensure that we have mirror clauses, guarantees, and we have 6 months to do so, because President Lula will be chairman for 6 months. Yes, we want to improve trade, but we want to respect our farmers and the coherence of our ambitions. It's no use for Europe to defend the climate. They would have to close down all of their industry because they would be importing substances which don't respect the climate. So yes, we have to improve the agreement. And it must take into account these mirror clauses with safekeeping clauses. We need an additional protocol that takes that into consideration so that when the markets are destabilized and there is unfair trade, that we can put the brakes on. And this is something that is necessary. This does not mean that we do not strategically defend international commerce.
Olha, eu acho que não está difícil fazer o acordo.
You've just been listening there to the French President Emmanuel Macron alongside the Brazilian President Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, who is